The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Doing Good Research Well, Socially Just Approaches for Collaborating with Marginalized Communities as an Outsider webinar brought to you by UCEA and the Jackson Scholars Network. Today we have Dr. Joseph Levitan and Dr. Kayla Johnson. And the reason we asked these two to speak with graduate students is because they have experience working in a number of different locations where they were working with marginalized communities as outsiders to the community. And speaking with Joe at UCEA, and since then we've talked about the different challenges that they faced and the ways that they had to learn to adapt to different communities of color. So I thought it would be helpful for them to share their experiences with all of you. Some of you work in marginalized communities and some of you come from marginalized communities. So you're able to type your questions in the chat box and Danny will get those together and ask them at the end. And I don't know if we sent out questions ahead of time or not. But if we did, then Danny will also get to those. So thank you very, very, very much for joining us today. And thank you, Dr. Levitan and Dr. Johnson, for bringing your expertise to our graduate students here. And I'll turn it over to you.
All right, great. Thanks, Holly. Thanks for the invitation. And also, I just want to say thanks to UCA and the Jackson Scholars for inviting us, and Danny for setting this up and doing a great job with that. So just to get started, I want to give you all an outline. First, welcome, thanks. We want to make this as fun and informative and informal as possible so that you can stay awake at your computers. So first, just in terms of getting a session outline together, so we're going to tell you a little bit about who we are. Holly did a nice job introducing us, but we want to give you a little bit more depth about our identities and where we come from so that you can understand how we're relating to the material and the ways in which we think about our work. Then we'll talk about the essential questions that we're going to cover, specifically focusing on how graduate students can think about some of these essential questions when they engage in research, share the issue, talking about researching as an outsider, and then most of the time we'll talk about what we've learned. Hopefully it won't take too long so that we can have time to answer questions. We want to dialogue with you as much as possible, even if it's through the computer. So just a little bit more about who we are. My name's Joe. I'm an assistant professor at McGill. My research interests are really focused on education for social justice, and I'll talk a little bit about how social justice is defined in different spaces later on. But really what I like to do is work with communities to collaborate on school design and educational design, particularly with populations that have been historically marginalized and populations whose voices haven't really been in the dialogue or the discourse or the discussion of educational development or educational work or school design. Most of my research focuses on identity, culture, and learning, and how learning is impacted by different cultural backgrounds and the cultures of a school, as well as different students' identities. A lot of what we're going to be talking about is with our work with the Sacred Valley Project and with Centro Educativo Payatayu. These are two organizations that are in Peru. We started Sacred Valley Project in 2009, so some of the work that we're going to be talking about dates back almost 10 years. There's about a decade of experience that we have talking about this kind of stuff. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a little bit, but I want to let Kayla introduce herself as well.
All right, hi everybody, my name's Kayla. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at McGill. I work with Joe. I'm also an instructor of higher education at Penn State, so I sort of have those dual appointments. My research interests are a little bit different from Joe's, but are complementary in a lot of different ways. So I like to look at issues of student learning and identity development, both within higher education, K-12, and non-formal contexts. A lot of that happens within contexts like study abroad and service learning. So as Holly had said, we've worked in a lot of different national and international contexts in this kind of work. And most of the research that I do has some kind of visual or collaborative or participatory aspect to it. I work a lot with photo cued interviewing and photo voice type methods. And so we'll be highlighting a little bit of that in what we're going to share with you. But as Joe said, a lot of the examples we're going to be talking about are framed through our work with these various organizations in Peru. And so along with Joe, I was the co-founder of Centro Educativo Pay at the IU. And Joe's going to, as he said, he'll explain a little bit about what those foundations are. Sort of interpersonally, Joe didn't say, if you want to say a little bit about your sort of personal identity.
Yeah, so I grew up in Baltimore City, kind of from a upwardly mobile working class family. I have some various identities that aren't particularly necessary right now, but you know, some of this kind of the background is, you know, I come from, you know, I'm a white cisgender male, come from the United States, we're working in Peru. That historical power dynamics and the historical background that I bring to any situation is going to affect how I can relate, or how I relate, especially initially with community. So it's important to think about some of these things as we start talking about this. And I want to be transparent and reflective about where I'm coming from, so that you can understand how these relationships developed and developed over time, and how we orient ourselves.
And I come from, so I'm a white cishet female, and I grew up in a low-income family in the rural Appalachian region of Ohio. And I was a first-generation college student, so a lot of those aspects of my identities also inform how I come to this work and the kinds of work that I'm interested in engaging in. And so we are sort of posing these questions to frame a lot of what we're talking about. Well, it's certainly not all that we're going to be discussing, but just sort of to, you know, frame the things that you're going to be hearing, we're going to be exploring how to learn to listen, so that ourselves as researcher outsiders can sort of get out of the biases and theoretical blind spots that we have. So how to interrogate who we are as people and as researchers, and the kinds of theories that we often bring to the research that we do. We're also going to explore how to build positive and productive relationships for insightful, actionable, and socially just research. So as outsiders, how can we come into these communities in ways that are positive and productive and actually contributing to socially just goals? And then finally, and most broadly, how to perform research with marginalized communities in a way that fosters social justice. And the key words here being with, not for, and social justice.
Right, and even though we will mostly be talking about work in Peru, we found that the lessons learned from this work have possible applications and transferable applications to other contexts and communities. Currently, we've taken some of this learning to work with public schools in Montreal. So we know that this is, you know, a specific context in space, and context is essential, but there's also important things that we think we can share with you all that will be relevant to your work beyond our particular context. And before we get started, I just want to share some important definitions, because it is important to think about how we are framing some of our work, and how our work contributes to social justice research and work. So when we start talking about equality, when we use the term equality, we're talking about making sure that all of the students, or all the people, or the population receive the same goods. So if that means everybody has the same materials, if that means that everybody, sorry, got a technical issue. Back on track. So in terms of equality, everybody's receiving the same goods. That means it doesn't matter what your particular aptitudes are, everybody is receiving the same amount, which is kind of one sense of fair. Equity means support for the same results, so making sure that everybody is successful for a particular minimum result, or a particular outcome. Whether that outcome is defined by the community or is defined by somebody else, that's an open question. And that's something that we're going to interrogate later on. And then we want to make a distinction between two kinds of social justice, and there are other scholars who talk about social justice in different ways, but this is one of the ways that we like to think about it. Constructive social justice means that each person can define their own considered goals, and then they receive what they need to achieve them. So this is kind of a positive vision of social justice. And then retributive social justice is thinking about how historical injustices have been acknowledged, addressed, and rectified. One of the ways that we are trying to engage with addressing retributive social justice is through a process of constructive social justice, so that we are ensuring that there's self-determination and communities are able to engage in their own self-defined goals, and then they receive what they need to achieve them. So all that being said, let's talk a little bit about the Sacred Valley Project and Centro Educativo Payatayu. In 2009, a good friend of mine asked for some support to help his goddaughter to get access to secondary school. He called me up one day. We were roommates in college. He had been, back in living and working in Peru, and he became a godfather, and this was really important to him, and so I decided to help him. So the beginning of this project was really connected to a social connection. Before that, I did not have much contact with Peru. I did, just beyond learning a little bit about the Incas in middle school, I really had not much knowledge of the background. But I was studying education. I was studying educational leadership and studying how to foster social justice in education, and I thought this would be a great project to support. Little did I know I'd still be working with it 10 years later. And the basic function of the Sacred Valley Project was to facilitate access to secondary school for Quechua and other indigenous young women who do not have access to schools. Most of these young women live in rural and remote communities who have 1 or 2 room primary schools, but secondary schools are 2 to 3 hours away walking. Most of the time they don't have roads with cars, so there's no way to bus or to do transport. And most of the students don't have the financial resources, even in those schools, free to pay for school supplies, pay for the uniform, the opportunity cost for leaving school, in terms of farming and herding can be really challenging. So the Sacred Valley Project was meant to facilitate that kind of access through providing an education center and dormitory so that students could go to school in a safe place with supportive Quechua speaking teachers to really help them achieve their goals, whatever those self-defined goals were. We learned a lot about how this, through the process of engaging with the community and talking about the community and recognizing the history of residential schools and other kinds of dormitory projects, we wanted to avoid some of the subtle and not so subtle oppressive facets of what this could be. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. The Centro Educativo Payatayu, which Kayla and I started in 2016, was stemming from our work with the Sacred Valley Project and recognizing that in community education that is community driven and culturally grounded would be a much more effective way to facilitate education for communities. So we started this to rectify that through questions, through basically a request from a good friend, and working closely with some of our other friends and colleagues that we made through our work with the Sacred Valley Project. This has really been a work of facilitating culturally grounded and community-driven education opportunities through sharing our ideas, but also listening really deeply and getting out of some of the historical, theoretical frameworks that we were working in before. So we'll talk a little bit about that in a little while.
Right, so as Joe shared, he didn't really know, like when he set out to do his graduate work in education, he didn't really envision that he would be working in Peru, but that, by way of the connections that he had made and the expertise that people saw with him, he was invited into the community to do this kind of work. And that really mirrors the kind of how I was able to enter into the community as well. It was actually an invitation from Joe. And so I say that to say, because throughout your career, it's really unlikely that you'll always be doing research as an insider. Whether it's a different school district or a different country, it's really important to think about the ways that being an outsider can impact the kind of research and practice that you're doing. And so it goes without saying, really, that outsiders perform research on marginalized populations is really problematic. And these problems can manifest in a number of ways. That might include speaking inaccurately for a community, whether it's misrepresenting community's knowledges due to your own ignorance, or willingly or willfully misrepresenting histories or aspects of various cultures. And it can also manifest in bringing different misguided ideas based on your own biases or misplaced cultural assumptions about a particular culture or community. And when this happens, it has a lot of potential negative results, like misunderstandings and mistrust between researchers and communities, or even between communities and academia more broadly. It can also result in a lot of wasted efforts, whether that's time or resources, but essentially putting a lot of effort into something that's not having positive contributions. And then it could also, much more concretely, contribute to a lot of harmful practices and policies that can actively harm the kinds of the members of the communities that you're engaging with. A really clear example of this would be the residential schools from Canadian history. The biggest part that we want to highlight here is the fact that compounded and grounded in all of these issues that are here is really the inherent power dynamics of the researcher researched and histories of domination and marginalization. And so we're always thinking about these issues as, you know, being inherently present in all of the work that we do. And so what we really try to think about is, what do we as, you know, the outsider researchers do about this? And so in order to work towards solutions and make sure that we curtail some of these issues, we really have to think about the subtle and relational and process-oriented approaches to research to make sure that the research that we're doing is being done well. And by well, we mean that it's thoughtful and it's really in alignment with the community's values as they're sharing them. And so from our experience, one of the biggest issues is when individual and communities' values and cultural assumptions really clash, especially when thinking about education. And so because these issues and these dynamics are constantly developing and they're really complex, a lot more work is needed. And this is really what drives our broader research agenda. How do we engage in this kind of research to do it really well?
That fosters constructive social justice. So there's a lot within that very broad question. We want to talk about 3 general principles or practices about doing good research. First is attention to power dynamics and transforming those power dynamics to be more equal. Second, thinking about reflexivity in a, you know, I think most graduate students, as everybody knows, have to reflect a lot throughout, especially in education. But the idea of reflexivity as freeing oneself from theoretical orthodoxy is a different way to approach some of the things that we're thinking about in terms of being an outsider, and what does theory mean when we engage with communities, and how does theory influence our decision making and our research approaches. And then finally, you know, thinking about attention to power dynamics and reflexivity, that hopefully will lead to self-determination in terms of doing good research well, which is building towards that kind of constructive social justice, which we think is a really important foundation to what social justice research orients itself as. So we'll talk a little bit about how these 3 principles are interacting and how they engage with one another.
So we're going to take you through each principle one by one, and then try to give a clear, explicit example of how we enact these principles in our own research. And these are going to be very distilled. So there's a ton of research out there about each of these principles. We're going to just sort of give you the highlights. So the first one that we want to talk about is attention to power dynamics. And the first idea is that researchers inherently come from privileged positions in society. Now, some of that privilege is maybe altered by racial or ethnic or gender identities in certain contexts, but really the role of the researcher carries a lot of significance. And even though that power isn't absolute, it's still power. And so being able to recognize yourself as a researcher with power in research context is the first step. But it's also important to recognize that within any group, there are a lot of different and fluctuating power dynamics. And so you really have to pay attention to power dynamics, not only in relation to your own power with the community, but also power between individuals within a group, because there might also be marginalized individuals within any group whose voices might not be being heard or aren't valued. And so as a researcher, this really means that attention to power dynamics might allow you to perhaps see more subtle issues within a group and to find new ways forward from different kinds of perspectives.
Right, and a lot of this has to do with positionality. So we know everybody comes from a different positionality, which means they have inherent, some, different facets of inherent power or different perceptions from others and towards others, which really, when we talk about reflexivity, that's really important, reflexivity and positionality when it comes to power. So recognizing one's own power to make changes, but also recognizing where other people are within those facets within a particular context to make sure that certain people who may not have as much of a voice will actually allow their voices to be heard.
And so just broadly speaking, in all of the research that we do with these communities, we try to position ourselves as co-learners with the communities and participants. And so, we don't position ourselves as experts, but just with people ideas. And that doesn't mean that we hide our expertise. And because of our expertise is actually why we've come into contact with a lot of these communities. But we do recognize that our expertise can perhaps be limited or maybe not 100% applicable in any given context. And so we're really conscious of presenting our expertise as ideas to be shared or built upon or changed by the communities that we're engaging with. And so that's really broadly speaking. Specifically, to give you a clear example of how we've enacted this in a research project, we spent this past spring semester in Peru speaking with first-generation indigenous students who had moved from rural to urban areas to access post-secondary education. And we were really interested in how that new access to post-secondary education had influenced their identities and identity development. And so we really sought out, we sought out first generation voices because they're historically marginalized in higher education across the board. And we also were very conscious of seeking out women's voices, because even when you do invite marginalized groups to share, women are often marginalized within those marginalized groups. And so we were very purposefully sought out those voices in this research project. And the kinds of method that we used, which was photo-cued interviewing, was very participant driven. And so we were making we made it very clear from the start that we wanted this research project to highlight the students' knowledges and experiences as they experience them. And so we selected a method that was going to allow them to represent the experiences as they wanted to, not perhaps driven by our own theoretical frameworks or anything else. So what we had students do was share their photos. This photo that we have here on the screen is an example from actually one of the graduates from the Sacred Valley Project. So she had gone through 5 years at the Sacred Valley Project, and has now enrolled in an instituto, which is like a trade school in Cusco. And one of the photos that she shared is of her community. And you can sort of see that there are some women doing some traditional dances. And she said that this photo really breaks her heart in a lot of ways, because this is an aspect of her culture that's not reflected in her post-secondary education. And so providing a space for that knowledge to be shared, which is what we wanted to do in this research project, has allowed us to understand how educational experiences can better support Indigenous student identity development. And all of that was driven by the students' knowledge themselves. And so the next step in this is also paying attention to those power dynamics, is that we want the students to be able to help disseminate that information with us. And so we're going to be arranging, when we go to Peru again, we're going to be arranging meetings with the university administrators, with the students present if they would like to be, however they would like their identities to be represented there. But also a public gallery walk that would showcase some of the photos that they took and some of the narratives that they shared in our interviews. Just making sure that at every level of the research, or every process, or every phase of the research process, that students are actively involved to the extent that they want to be.
Right, and just in terms of making sure this is clear in terms of research ethics, the student that we're talking about was very, we made sure that she was okay with us sharing this picture. The reason that the picture is a little blurry is because we wanted to make sure that there are no faces. So we just want to make sure that, we were very clear with our participants, and they're actually, from what they've told us, very happy and willing to share their pictures to construct the narratives that they think have not been heard well enough by university administrators or by others in Cusco, because there is still a lot of, bigotry against rural Indigenous students, rural Quechua speaking students, and other Indigenous students. And so, some of this is to make sure that that gets out there in a way that will be impactful for the community, which ultimately will be from the students' voices primarily, and we'll just help facilitate that. So in terms of thinking about this relational dynamic and how power is used and transformed to make sure that the students or the teachers or, principals, if you're working with principals, how that shifts from researcher to research to collaborator or collaborative researchers together. One of the most important things that we have learned is thinking about our own reflexivity and our own biases and theoretical orthodoxy, which is slightly different than a bias. But I'll tell you a little bit about that in a second. Biases, generally speaking, as defined, are usually preferences that are not related to empirical facts or realities or whatever you want to call it, and empirical or interpersonal realities. Theoretical orthodoxies, on the other hand, are really what we as researchers start to get trapped into, and is what we argue. We may be decolonial theorists, we may be post-colonial theorists, we may be development theorists, we may be critical theorists. Those theories, as important as they are, sometimes if they are adhered to too quickly or too closely, can actually misinterpret and warp the voices and thinking of the people that we're working with. And so one of the things that we really want to argue is that while it's necessary to have a deep grounding in theory in order to orient your research, getting stuck within a theoretical framework can lead to unjust actions. And reporting and research and using multiple theories as part of your reflexive process is really important for getting out of some of that theoretical trapping. We are trained often as researchers to, pick a theory or, have a research question, have a methodology, have a theory to interpret it, and stick to that. When working with community members and working in dialogue and working collaboratively, getting out of some of that more kind of overstructured thinking can really be helpful to open our, to open your eyes, to open our eyes. For us, we found this to be really helpful to open our eyes to making sure that self-determination is happening, because oftentimes, what the individuals are saying don't fit neatly into any given theory. And in fact, you have to think about it from multiple theoretical perspectives when you are engaging in the research and the methods. So we have also found that few objectives in the world are actually diametrically opposed. They can also often be synthesized and worked out. In terms of what this actually means in practice, I just want to give a little example of some work that we did with the students of the Sacred Valley Project when we were asking them to define their goals and understand what they mean by success. So instead of just thinking of goals as, what we assume goals are to be, what a good life means from a Western context, we really wanted to understand how they defined and how they understood what it means to have their own good life. And so we used a variety of words, and we've been, we had 3 or 4 days of dialogue with the students. And ultimately, we asked the question, after thinking about success and different goals, what does success mean to you? Through a lot of conversation, one of the main facets of their conversation, and one of the places where consensus was strongest, was becoming a professional was really what success meant to them, to these 16 girls. You were talking with 16 girls, and we were helping them develop their own education plans, more or less. So when they said that, we asked, okay, so what does a professional mean to you? What is a professional? And after kind of a long pause, the student said, someone who wears a suit. So I came from, kind of a decolonial, post-colonial theoretical orientation. To me, that seemed very problematic, but then I also realized that this is what the students are saying, and if we're going to really engage with kind of the framework that we're talking about, if we're really going to engage with self-determination, if we're really going to engage with real dialogical changes in terms of power, and we're going to really transform the power dynamic, we need to listen really deeply to what the students are saying, and I need to break out of my decolonial bias and post-colonial bias, which seemed that, to me, that meant cultural marginalization. That means the students have been acculturated to think that Western suits, not Quechua traditional clothes, which are brightly colored, which are dresses and hats that, have really important meanings in Quechua society, are less important than someone, than wearing a suit. And there's also interpretations about what it means to be a professional in terms of making money and entering into the marketplace of capitalist society, which is not currently where they are. So I thought about this kind of these definitions and thinking about the ways in which students engage with their own education from 4 different perspectives. So from a feminist perspective, especially from a Western feminist perspective, not an indigenous feminist perspective necessarily, but from a kind of where we came from in the West, that can be seen as empowered or empowering. Students are saying we want to be out of the homes, we want to become professionals, which has certain standing in society. So there's a sense of empowerment that is inherent in that, which is, especially for this generation, they're the first in their families to go to school, and this is transformational in some ways. From a critical lens, this could be considered a false consciousness because they're entering into capitalist society, which is inherently going to be working against who they are and where they, how they labor and what their labor means. From a development theory perspective, economic mobility, bringing in education for economic mobility to, make sure that they know what professional kind of code of conduct is, what wearing a suit is, and how to wear the suit could be one of the implications for education. And then, like I said, in the post-colonial, there's cultural marginalization. So even in something as simple and as kind of short and sweet as this little example, there are a lot of implications that we, as a Western researcher, we don't really know how to engage with. And so this has allowed us to be more subtle in our ways of thinking about theory and interpretation when engaging in research. And, this is a complex argument, so there's more you can talk about with her through the article that's cited at the bottom. So anyway, all of that being said, I know it's a little bit long. Here's some of the ways of getting out of biases in theoretical orthodoxy. So don't make the project's goals or objectives static. Instead, think of them as part of an iterative, interactive process. Think about issues from multiple theoretical frameworks in addition to including multiple perspectives. So making sure that you're also taking into perspective other people, such as parents, elders, but also in your own reflexivity, thinking from multiple theoretical frameworks, and analyze and understand power, positionality, and relational dynamics so that you're able to transform them within yourself in order to contribute to their change in the context of the project, whatever that project is. In this case, it was an action research project, but it could be an ethnographic project. It could be most qualitative projects that are engaging deeply with the community.
And so all of the things that we just shared, the examples and the 2 principles, what they really are trying to get at is this concept of self-determination. And what we're really interested in here for our talk is, what does this actually mean for researchers who are not part of the marginalized group that we're working with? So as an outsider, how do you help facilitate self-determination? And so just at the very foundational level, self-determination is foundational to social justice research and also practice. And so what this means is that marginalized communities should be able to determine what is best for them. They should be selecting their own goals, their own outcomes. And that should be based in whatever realities it is that they're facing. So ultimately determined by them. But the problem is that really a lot of education reform movements often happen top down. And so the people who are making the decisions are not necessarily members of the community. And so the people who these decisions are actually affected by aren't actually invited to the table and have their voices heard. But the interesting part about it is that self-determination really does align with best practices in education. And so, just the idea that when students can determine their own learning goals, we see a lot more positive outcomes, whether that's greater academic achievement, whether that's self-esteem, self-efficacy, well-being. A lot of these academic and social emotional outcomes are directly related to whether students actually get a say in their education.
So just to add to that, one of the things that's important as researchers is, especially when working with communities that have been historically marginalized, you're not only performing research, you're also modeling behaviors of engagement, and you're modeling your behaviors as who holds the power and what does this power mean. So doing research, especially in education, is not only a research process, but it's also almost a pedagogical practice, because you're building relationships, and those relationships are going to have effects on not only what your research outcomes are, but the community and how the community sees their role in their own development, because historically researchers have had positions of privilege and power. So, you know, building these relationships and ensuring that these relationships are based on more equal footing, making sure that you're modeling positive relationship building where the work that you're doing stays, you know, is directly attributable to the community, that the self-determination, you know, you're facilitating, you know, the access to certain resources as a researcher as well. So it's not just an extraction, but it's really facilitation of bringing resources towards, you know, to the community so that they can work with those resources themselves.
And so the best example of how we're thinking about and trying to enact these, the facilitation of self-determination, is through our entire approach that we've taken with Centro Educativo para IU, or SEPA as we more affectionately call it. And so what we've done with SEPA is that it is an entirely community-driven approach. And in doing this and in seeking out community voices and including them in the development of our educational opportunities, it affords different opportunities for students and their parents to choose what they want to learn. And so what we did from day one, when the community reached out to us and asked us if we could help them develop this kind of in-community education center, is we were very intentional about asking, you know, what is it that you want out of this? You know, what are your goals for schooling and beyond? What do you want students and yourselves to be able to do with this education? And so some of the things that they asked us for the first year were computer skills. So they were looking ahead and saying, well, the kinds of job opportunities that are available to us require certain computer skills, whether it's in tourism. So this is a community that's located close to Machu Picchu. So whether it's tourism, whether it is accounting, these are all job opportunities that are going to require a level of computer skills that they've not historically had access to. And so we facilitated a computer lab. And so we offer computer training classes to parents, to students. We also do some Quechua, Spanish, and English language literacy, as well as a number of other things. But these are all things that the community asked for. And one of the things that came out of that is the fact that, you know, when the students were seeing that they were learning things that were relevant to them and things that they actually wanted to learn, it really developed a lot of cultural pride, a lot of pride in what they were doing in the education center, a lot of pride in their community itself. And one of the ways that manifested is this is the cover of an annual magazine that the students helped put together that really showcases the knowledges that they've gathered and that they're wanting to share with others. And so we distribute this throughout the region, this region in the Peruvian Andes. And because of that, the word about what we've done with this community has spread, and we've actually been contacted by a number of other communities who want to start similar kinds of education centers for themselves. And so what this means is that as our research, as Joe and I's research in the work in the Andes is growing, we've really had to think about how to make our processes more explicit, both for us as we continue to do this more, and think of ways that we could improve upon our approach, and also for others, maybe like you, who want to engage in this kind of community-driven and social justice-oriented framework.
So we're almost done here, just to wrap up, and then we can have some conversation. So one framework that we have started to develop that we're still working on, but we think has been pretty helpful, is a culturally grounded curriculum research paradigm. So the way in which we see curriculum development now, as in the field of educational leadership, is different than historically how it has been understood. So, for example, instead of having curriculum be designed by experts in content, curriculum development is an iterative process. There's content experts, but the expertise is not absolute. It is an iterative process. It is a dialogue. It is in conversation, so that the knowledge that is generated is the knowledge that is of most worth for that particular community or those communities in that region. Curricula and objectives are built with the community, like I said, and then curriculum content is grounded in community epistemologies. So instead of putting on outside epistemological frameworks like Newtonian physics or something like that, curriculum content is grounded in the community epistemologies themselves, because they're defining what's important in their development of the curriculum. Finally, students are encouraged to critically question and value their realities and remake their world as a response to unjust structures, and success is defined collaboratively and is meant to remake social and economic realities. So this work builds from the work of Geneva Gay, Gloria Ladson-Billings, Brian Brayboy, James Banks, and Django Paris, but it is applied to different contexts and applied to communities whose historical marginalization looks a little bit different than that in the United States, because there is still a strong cohesion within. There are a lot of assets and a lot of strength and pride within those communities that are isolated from other facets of the globalizing world. So it's slightly different than what it would look like in an urban environment.
And just as an FYI, if you're interested in learning more about the framework, we do have a number of articles sort of in the works right now, including one that is just about to come out in a special issue in the International Journal of Student Voice. And this is a special issue that's focusing all on highlighting girl voices in education, specifically Indigenous girl voices. So be on the lookout for that.
Okay, so all that being said, these are our experiences. We've learned a lot over these past 10 years. We also are continuing to learn, and we're continuing to develop our, understanding of how to do this. Here are some guiding questions that we have about our own reflexive process that we think are worth pondering.
Yeah, and these are questions that we still think about when we engage, even with communities that we're very, in many ways, insiders in now. We've been working there for about a decade. Then we still have to think about these on an ongoing basis. And so we sort of grouped them into 3 domains here. But the first one is just being very aware of that you need to examine what your project objectives are and what various definitions of good might be. And some important questions to think about are who is making these definitions and who is creating the objectives. So who are the people in power here whose voices are being the most heard? And then related, how might different objectives unwittingly oppress or harm individuals who don't have much power? So is somebody benefiting? Is somebody being oppressed by the different objectives that are coming to the table? And then very much inherent in those questions are ideas of power and participant voice. So what are the power dynamics between different groups and or individuals? So both yourself as a researcher in relation to the community, but again, within the community itself. And when you're examining that, pay close attention to who is afforded a louder voice. So who has more time at the table, who is being heard more, and who might not be heard, but also who is important to listen to in this context. So that adds another level of nuance that we don't often think about. So there's always the who is heard and who is not, but also which voices should we specifically be seeking out. And then finally, thinking about decision-making and actually implementing ideas. Thinking about, are the decision-making processes just? And if so, or if not, in what ways are they just or not? And then how are ideas interpreted and put into action? So how are we taking all of the voices here and actually implementing them and doing something about it?
So these are some questions that we think about on a regular basis, especially as we design and develop further projects and research projects and action research projects in these communities. But some of the practices for consideration are, kind of making sure that the work is dynamic, that is iterative, that is interactive. This means we start much more quickly engaging with the community so that, we might have a plan, but we're willing to throw that plan out if the community says, this is what we really want to do. What you have to say, it's not relevant. So I say, okay, we got to switch it up. So it's important for us to start early. We want to make sure that we take multi-theory and multi perspectives, multiple perspectives on our interpretations, to interrogate our own interpretations, and to make sure that we aren't biasing the voices one way or another based on our own theoretical proclivities. And we want to analyze, understand, and transform the power, positionality, and relational dynamics that we have with our collaborators, with our partners. This is a deep and long-term process. I would say it took 3 or 4 years to really get to understand each other, and that's through a lot of sitting around and talking, a lot of eating food, a lot of engaging deeply and personally, just on a kind of a partnership colleague level with friends and community members. So this is a transformative process in some ways, but it can be facilitated more or less quickly depending on your orientation to it. So yeah, that's pretty much what we have to say about this. There's a lot of other things to be said, but we're hoping that this kind of quick overview is thought-provoking at the least. So thank you for your time, and
we'd love to have any questions. I'm not sure if anybody has shared any in the chat, but feel free to go ahead and pose those.
Right, and at the end, Daniel's going to share upcoming events and say goodbye. So.
Okay, Dr. Johnson, Dr. Levitan, thank you for that. It's very informative and interesting. And luckily, I do have some questions for you, so we're not quite done. These are graduate student generated questions, and I apologize if they're a little bit repetitive. Just, perhaps you can elaborate for us. Before I give you those questions, I want to say, if our listeners are interested in the Centro Educativo Payata IU, are interested in your work, maybe perhaps they'd like to participate or support it in some way, where could they go to find information? Would you like them to email you, or what could they do?
Yeah, I think so. The easiest thing for us is to email. We do have websites for both of them, but I think the easiest thing would be to email us. Also, if you're interested in some resources, we cited a few things, but there's a lot of resources out there. A lot of really great thinkers and scholars have talked about this, other than us, and we have a nice resource list if anybody's interested. But yeah, email us first. I think that would be great.
You can also find us on social media, on Facebook and on Twitter for both.
Okay, great. Thank you. I have a question about language, and how important do you think language is in this type of social justice and equity work? Do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, definitely. So language is really important. It's one of the essential aspects because it does define epistemology. We speak Spanish when we're there, but we're also learning Quechua because Quechua is really important to sustain as part of this social justice work. How can you have self-determination if you can't speak your own language? The challenge of being an outsider sometimes is that kind of code switching, and also learning the language, learning the Spanish that is in the Peruvian Andes is a different Spanish than what would be in Lima, which is different than what would be in Mexico.
Or different from what we're formally taught in education in the United States.
Right. And a lot of what we try to do with the language practices is we're actually working on a project right now to build a Quechua computer-based learning approach that's project-oriented and that's culturally grounded, but that is going to be in Quechua. So language is essential. Those kind of translations and the practical facets of it are also kind of challenging.
But also, and I mean, another facet of language that we're really cognizant of is like demystifying different concepts of education. And so we try to be very conscious, like we're not going in and using terms like social justice, we're not going in and using terms like self-determination, because those don't have any meaning for individuals in these contexts. And so we're really conscious of, abandoning a lot of that academic jargon and just being a lot more relational with the communities. And then from an academic standpoint, I mean, we've highlighted this and demonstrated this throughout the presentation, but just framing our work as research with communities and not for. So even that aspect of language is something that we think about a lot, and it's really important for doing social justice work.
Yeah, I did have a question about, the power dynamics and positionality, but I think you did a really good job of answering that and referring to the process of becoming co-learners and sharing, the whole process. So I'm going to move on to the next question. What would you say to anyone that might argue that research should be done by insiders and not outsiders? And you were invited to the community. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So a lot of what we also do, we sort of frame what we do as around capacity building. And so I think we would also agree that it would be best if research was performed by insiders. And so I could talk specifically, not necessarily about, well, okay, Joe wants to share.
Well, so
I have an example, but Joe wants to share first.
So I think that the idea of, research is best done with, through kind of grounded in insider epistemology is valuable, but it's also important, similar to the idea of multiple perspectives and multiple theoretical frameworks. Having multiple perspectives is really important as well. Having a critic, having an outside critic of our own culture, of having somebody come from another country to, whether it's Baltimore City or whether it's Montreal, and sharing their perspectives, as long as it's not done in a way that is kind of domineering or dominant, can be very insightful and be very helpful. So the issue, a lot of what we're talking about, and a lot of what the issue is for us, is the how of how this is happening. So it's not just insider outsider, it's how does the insider engage, how does the outsider engage with this process, because that's where the insights happen. And if it's not done in a domineering way, or if it's done in a way that is, considerate and relational, and making sure that the power to make decisions is fully within the community, that's important. It's offering ideas, it's offering observations, it's not making conclusions, and that's important in terms of the how. So I think the argument is overly simplistic to say that an insider is the only person who should be doing this. That's not to say that it doesn't happen. That's not a really strong argument right now, but I think the how is really important, because the how is where insights occur and are taken up or not taken up. So we agree that the best position, for a lot of this work is inside, to make sure that there's a deep knowledge, but it's also, it's not an either or, it's an and. It's also valuable to have outside perspectives, having been invited, it's being invited to share perspectives. It's not being invited to make conclusions.
Okay. Thank you. And so I have one final question for you. This one is about implications of your work in ed leadership, in school reform, in policy, that kind of thing.
Yep. So, so I think having gone through kind of the PhD process and the graduate student process, and learning about school reform and policy, and kind of the siloing of certain facets of knowledge, what we have been trying to do now in Montreal public school systems is to break down some of those silos through this approach, through engaging students in a really robust student voice activity, through engaging parents in a really robust parent sharing activity, and then translating that for principals and teachers, so that we can be a facilitator in a way that researchers have an opportunity to build connections and build bridges that overtaxed principals and overtaxed teachers and policymakers may not have that just time and capacity, because there's so many different things to do. So we're able to build bridges of communication in public school systems to actually change the systems. And we're working closely with one school right now that's actually changing some of their practices because of the students' recognition of kind of the relational dynamics between teachers and project-based learning. And so they're implementing some interesting project-based learning practices because of the students' suggestions and recognitions of it. So, we changed our power dynamic with students and had the students be placed as experts in what is important to them. And that has allowed us to have insights to then relate back to teachers, and even the school board is starting to listen. So there are some implications. It has to look different, and it has to be in alignment with the different cultures that one is engaging with. But there's definite possibilities in terms of implications for how researchers can engage in this in terms of school reform and changing the dynamics of power within who's actually making those decisions.
Right, and like practice implications. So we're thinking about research to practice. I would say the two biggest ones are just the fact that we can't do educational decision making top down anymore. It needs to come from communities, and we, as Joe said, we need to incorporate student voices more, and do that, have frameworks that do that more explicitly. And part of that is going to be, you know, retraining and reskilling educational leaders to think like that, because I think, you know, even in our own preparation work, there are aspects that maybe weren't framing decision-making processes in that way. And then the second practical implication is just knowing that it might require some shifting of resources. And so in order to do this work well, communities are going to have to be better resourced with teachers, with learning materials and things that are really grounded in and reflective of their particular cultures. And so just recognizing those two very, very basic but very important practical aspects of educational leadership and development are really important.
Well, thank you for that. From the entire graduate student community, I want to say thank you for your time, your effort, and this incredible contribution to our webinar series. Dr. Johnson, Dr. Levitan, we appreciate you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
It's really great to have the opportunity to speak with you. And if there's anybody who wants to continue the conversation, please feel free to email us. We're happy to talk and learn and share.
Well, they definitely will. I will go ahead and wrap up our webinar by just giving you some upcoming events. The UCA Jackson Scholars Network does not take any time off during the summer. We have a webinar coming up July 18th. That's Establishing the Contours of Your Research Agenda with Dr. Irene Yoon. On August 8th, we have Preaching It, Practical Advice to Start Your Semester Right with Dr. Judy Austin. And of course, the UCA convention is right around the corner. This year, it's in New Orleans. Early registration is now open. If you need more information, you can go to ucea.org. And then, as usual, this webinar will be archived. You can go onto uca.org, click graduate student, the graduate student tab at the top, and then you want to click on resources. And you will find our most recent webinars, and this one will be up probably within 24 to 48 hours. And so I guess that's it. Thank you for attending. And again, Dr. Johnson, Dr. Levitan, thank you so much. And I hope everyone has a great weekend.
Great.
Thank you.